All right, we got an audience. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Heartwood, When City Trees Equal Justice. A few housekeeping things before we begin. First, please note that this webinar is actually being recorded. And second, captioning is available for this webinar through AvaScribe. You can actually access the closed captioning by clicking on the closed captioning button below in your Zoom toolbar. Third, there's several ways to actually interact with this webinar. So our host, Josh Klipp, will be watching the Q&A box. So feel free to add questions there and he'll either answer them as we go along or save them for the panelists at the end of their presentations or follow up with you specifically after the webinar. And if you need any assistance during the webinar, please raise your hand using the raise hand functionality and Josh will reach out to you as quickly as possible. Finally, the structure of today's webinar is as follows. We'll start with a brief introduction of the topic of each of today's panelists, and the panelists will provide short presentations. And then towards the end, we'll open it up for Q&A. So at the end of today's event, we'll make sure that you have a few action items, ideas on how you can make a change in the world that needs as many of us as change makers as we can get. So quick note that many of you have asked some really awesome questions during the registration process, and some may be answered today and some may be answered in the later webinar series. So that means tune into this webinar series as this moves forward. But our host, Josh, has offered to personally connect with anyone who has specifically any questions. So you can reach out to him at Joshua Klipp, that's JOSHUAKLIPP @gmail.com. Just remember, he's only one human, so he's not around 24 hours a day to do this, so please be patient and give him some of that courtesy. And with that, let's go ahead and start. So my name is Gino Ramos, and I'm a senior manager of equality programs at Salesforce, and I currently work in employee engagement. And when it comes to our core value of equality, it's everything that I get to do on a day-to-day basis. And some of our ways that we actually engage are through our employee resource groups, one of which is EarthForce. It's our employee resource group dedicated to promoting and celebrating environmental sustainability. And with EarthForce, they actually partner with our Office of Sustainability at Salesforce on a ton of different initiatives around the globe 24/7 all throughout the year. And around that, there's actually one initiative that they just launched this past week called trees.salesforce.com. It's a tree tracker in partnership with the Plant for the Planet organization, where you as a public citizen can actually donate around the world to have trees planted around the world to support the mobilization and conservation, restoration, and growth of over 100 million trees as a goal by 2030. So go ahead and feel free to check that link out at trees.salesforce.com, and hopefully you can help make an impact today and make this world a better place. And so if you're here today, you probably understand that climate change is very real, and that if we don't act quickly, it actually might be too late. So out here on the West Coast, we've watched over 5 million acres burn in unprecedented wildfires over this last few months, with ashes of millions of trees blocking the sun, making it orange out here. And it's really caused the air to be unhealthy and unable to be breathed in. And what you may not know is, right here in the US, the air has already been unhealthy to breathe for many millions of Americans for many decades. And over 100 years of policy, regulations, and infrastructural planning choices have actually resulted in the reduced tree cover and access to trees for people with disabilities and communities of color all over the country. This in turn has had a serious consequence in terms of both mental and physical health. In communities like San Francisco's Bayview District, for example, the community is largely a group of people of color and has the highest city's asthma rate. So with that tree cover lacking, it's shockingly low at 6.7%. For people with disabilities, trees are frequently cut down from public streets and rights of way in the name of accessibility. But there's rarely any sort of equivalent focus on ensuring that people with disabilities actually have equal access to trees. So with that, we're going to kick off our first guest, Karin Korb. Karin is a policy and public affairs coordinator for the Lakeshore Foundation. She's also a 2-time Paralympian and 10-time member of the USA World Team. She served on the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee Athletes Advisory Council for 8 years and currently serves as Alabama State Rehabilitation Advisory Council, as well as the Alabama Disabilities Advocacy Programs, PADD, otherwise known as Protection and Advocacy of Persons with Developmental Disabilities Advisory Council. She also serves on several boards of directors, including America Walks. Obviously, she's super qualified to talk about this today, so she's deeply passionate about inclusions of persons with disabilities at every level of sport, wellness, and life. Over to you, Karin.
Thank you so much, Gino. My name is Karin, obviously, and my pronouns are she, her. I am a white disabled woman. I'm a wheelchair user, to be specific, for the last 36 years. I have long blonde hair, and I'm wearing a beige and blue patterned shirt. I am currently zooming in from New Jersey as an uninvited guest of the Munsee Lenape land, whose place name is Achqua Kanunk, which is an area alongside the Passaic River. That means a place in a rapid stream where fishing is done with a bush net. Thank you, Josh, for your never-ending vision to make this world a better place. My fellow panelists, it is who also hold these same ideals, and our viewers, obviously. It's a privilege to share this space with you today. I am a lover of trees, and I'm also a disabled person who is representative of an entire group of people. We as disabled people are not a monolith. I live with a lot of privilege, so I'm speaking very personally and not necessarily on behalf of all the siblings with disabilities that I have out there in the world. I will do my best. This is an overview. I'm a lover of trees. I grew up in Germany, in a little town on the outskirts of Frankfurt, and at the time, the name was Heinstadt and is now named Hainbuch. My backyard was der Wald, which means the forest. We played there, we hid there, we breathed there. Our family walked, talked, and moved together there. I experienced my first kiss there. And when I return home, which is Germany, I'm also the only American born in my entire lineage. I can still be amidst those trees, and the pathways are packed with dirt, and they're worn paths now. And me and my wheelchair, we can go there, and it's a total vibe. And I'm so grateful for that. Josh, can you pop onto that first slide? I want to talk about 3 things that are super important to me, and hit that middle video. Josh, can you hear it? Yeah. I don't know if our audience can hear that. I'm not sure. Yeah.
I think I need to unmute myself to make it happen. Just a moment.
Okay, right on. Can you hear the beautiful rain? It's so great. Look at my phone. And I am in a dry spot because I am under a tree. You know, I love the rain, and I cardio in the rain at a very specific park. And I have a colleague, her name is Amelia O'Hare, and she's a planner and also a power chair user. And when I shared this love of rain and these other 2 things that I want to share with you, she said, you know, Karin, she's a budding landscape architect as well. She's like, you know, there's words for that. And I was like, what? And so number 1 is the sound of rain. Makes me a pluviophile. I also love when sunlight filters through the leaves of a tree, and there's a Japanese word called komorebi. And number 3, the sound of wind in the trees where the leaves rustle, or when palm tree leaves rustle. There's a name for that, and it's sitharism. The pictures on the screen, which you'll see, they're just trees, and there's an asphalt pathway, and there's sunlight filtering through the trees. It's one of my favorite places, and it's Brookdale Park. And Brookdale Park is an urban park. It is once the gathering place for the Lenni Lenape Indians. In 1931, when they began building the park, after we stole the land, of course, but that's a whole nother conversation. It's a 121 acre stretch. It's an urban park in the middle of Bloomfield and Montclair, New Jersey. It's a deeply sentimental park for me because I played there when I was a kid, way before I broke my back. And it also was a park that had tennis courts. So in my up and coming professional wheelchair tennis career, this tennis courts were embedded within the trees, and it gave a lot of shade. And for those of you who do play tennis or are active outside, tree shade is like critically important, so you just don't keel over and die on the tennis court. So, and now fast forward to today. I'm working remotely out of my mother's house here in New Jersey, and I am incredibly risk averse because I am disabled. I know what happens to disabled people when, if you're diagnosed with COVID, you are not prioritized due to medical bias, but that's also a whole nother conversation. I go to this park about 5:30, 6:30 in the morning where I feel the safest. Due to coronavirus, we have a mask ordinance within the park, and I'm happy to say that people follow the rules there. So I feel really safe, but I also feel safe as a disabled woman in a public park, which we can also have an entire different webinar on. But I would encourage this audience to check out America Walk's website for webinars that relate to walking and moving with respect to equity and justice in outdoor spaces and places. I believe that I'll have all those links captioned in the chat box at the end. I want to also bring forward a quote from Dr. Rua Benjamin. She says, "Remember to imagine and craft the world that you cannot live without, just as you dismantle the ones you cannot live within." And she also goes on to say, how do we develop approaches to health and well-being that don't simply substitute technological fixes for wider social change? Fixes that do more to widen the gross inequities that already stratify life chances. How do we advance life sciences without reinforcing popular conceptions of race as biological, gender as destiny, or disability as tragic? After all, as we push the boundaries of the human with science and technology, we are also reinforcing and sometimes redrawing social fault lines in often very unexpected ways. People with disabilities experience deep and persistent inequality. We are the world's largest minority at 1.3 billion people worldwide, and 1 in 4 Americans have a disability, which I actually think that number is a lot larger, because the number that's reported is the number of people that actually disclose that they have some type of limitation or disability. We disabled people, for the most part, continue to be unseen and segregated within our own communities. We live with the highest rates of unemployment and poverty, disproportionate levels of gender-based, non-binary, trans police violence, as we're seeing in the news every single day, and adding race into all of the aforementioned identifiers. And then let's add in the medical industrial complex and how we must continue to confront stigma and discrimination just trying to get access to some type of health care. Every one of those outcomes that relates to women, those of color, sexual minorities, religious and ethnic minorities are exacerbated. You throw in ableism, which compounds structural racism, class, and gender discrimination, and that is the reality of what disabled people experience. And even though many social movements are beginning to include disability into their existing narratives, it is so slow with respect to having any prioritization within those movements. So Josh, again, thank you for including disability in this conversation. Can you pop into the next slide? Thanks. So the next slide, at Lakeshore Foundation, we host many military camps for veterans and their family members. And there's a big shout out to Susan Robinson, who runs those military camps with her team at Lakeshore Foundation. These pictures are taken at Camp Aska, which is located in Jackson Gap, Alabama. It sits on Lake Martin, an approximately 230 wooded acres that offers all different types of people who visit a variety of traditional, recreational, and educational activities. And most importantly, it has a unique design for accessibility of all different types of disabilities. I have the privilege of running the guided meditations and also wheelchair tennis at the camps, because amidst the extensive tree canopies. And in one of the pictures, you'll see there is an open air, what looks similar to a chapel, and it's made of wood and has a concrete floor, and it is surrounded by such beautiful and large trees. And there is a vibe there that is absolutely mind-blowingly incredible. And as you all may know, many of our veterans have severe post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and high levels of anxiety. You couple that with a varying amount of physical disabilities. This is a group that prefers to be in environments that are predictable, with just the right amount of solitude and potential for activity. Open spaces like the ones shown on the slide, these create an interdependence that I think we all crave, specifically those with disabilities, and opportunities to engage in physical activity that, those who have acquired their disabilities or may have never experienced outdoor spaces that are accessible to someone with a physical disability or a learning disability or a developmental disability, that they've ever been able to experience or participate in. We center our veterans in what we do, and we also have, and we're happy to share, powerful data that supports these types of camps and these experiences because it's a critical health benefit in outdoor environments. Two of my dear friends in the pictures, it was the first time that they were in an outdoor accessible space. And it's the first time they ever played tennis. They didn't know that they could play tennis. And again, sometimes someone with a disability will have body temperature regulation issues. And one of the main reasons that we're amidst these trees, again, is because of that shade. It is so important because you don't even know what's happening to your body sometimes, when you're a person with a disability. Can you forward to the next slide for me, please, Josh? Cool, thank you. And this last slide is of Muir Woods. And some of you out in San Fran may be familiar with Muir Woods. It is something that was brought to me by my dear friend Josh while I was out in San Francisco. And I had no idea that this place, it's about, I would say approximately 40 minutes outside of San Francisco. I mean, I had never been amongst the redwoods in this way, ever, in my entire life. When I think about it in my meditation, it brings me back to a place of prana that is almost indescribable. It was an extraordinary experience for me, as it was raining that day. And we all know how much I love the rain, but more so there was nobody there. There's probably like 5 people that we encountered in the entire adventure. I was completely alone in that forest. And I felt the history of these trees. And it was like, and for those of us who love trees, it's like how trees talk to you, like the prana of the redwoods. They just kind of let me know that that they're going to protect me and they're going to give to me forever. And it was a real cathartic experience for me, and I'm looking forward to going back to that again. But what I want to point out is a sense of belonging. When we design our spaces, and in my work at Lakeshore Foundation, I have the privilege of working within the built environment systems and active transportation. And we don't necessarily always prioritize people with disabilities or multiply marginalized people. And I get to work in these very specific spaces that elevate the importance, resourcing and prioritizing disabled people and those with chronic health conditions. This particular area, and there are many like Muir Woods, they have designated accessible parking, assisted listening, accessible restrooms, accessible trails, the brochures that are in Braille, large print materials, ASL, American Sign Language videos. The mental health benefits of just knowing that you can go into a space and not struggle is insurmountable. And for people who do not have disabilities, it's something, you live with non-disabled privilege. It's something that you don't necessarily ever have to think about. You can request at this park active listening devices, ranger-led tours that contain audio description, the Muir Woods brochure, wayside along the main trail. They can provide copies of the Muir Woods brochure in Braille. I mentioned that earlier. There's a boardwalk that I can push independently with my wheelchair, my manual wheelchair and power wheelchair. It's a non-issue. It's about a 1.5-mile loop. The boardwalk is about several hundred feet until you get into what's called I may not pronounce this correctly, so forgive me, the Pincho Tree area. There is accessible waysides along the boardwalk. And if you go past the boardwalk, there's an asphalt area. And I know there's a lot of conversation around, you're going to ruin the area because you're going to put asphalt. It was designed in a universally designed way. So there was no damage. And there created an immense sense of inclusion and belonging, because it is my understanding that the group who created this was a diverse and inclusive group. And the D in diversity, my friends, is disability. Okay. Disabled people live in a world that is utterly hostile to us all the time. It was built that way. And we're always expected to settle for the minimum accommodation, minimum access. And in the examples that I brought forward, and there are many similar to what I experienced, which is belonging and access. It is still a very rare experience for multiply marginalized people due to the fact that we have education, housing, transportation, and healthcare issues that are completely prevalent, especially now. And you throw in the multiple identifiers, and it is a disproportionate amount of discrimination that happens to disabled people all the time. While the benefits for outdoor spaces, specifically trees, they are also weaponized within the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, where the ADA is often used as an excuse to remove trees to create access without, and let me say this again, without a plan to restore those trees that have been removed in the name of access. Personally, I'm not down with that. I feel that we can do both. We are in a very creative time, and there are amazing landscape architects out there and planners that can help. They need to be diverse. When I think about those conversations, it tells me that compliance remains at the surface, and it's minimizing to access. The conversation is, how we're not going to sue the city versus addressing disability as a culture, and how a culture of people benefit from nature, outdoor recreational spaces, and specifically the benefit of trees. In conclusion, I want people, and I know I went over this very quickly, I want people to think critically about our world, be empathetic, and create change for the better. And in order to do this, and I know my fellow panelists will bring this forward, and in order to do this, it will require confronting oppression and the levels of harm in every way. And I'm going to close with a quote from Danielle Cook. And she says, "With every painful blow of injustice, the question should no longer be, what easy thing can I do to help now? But what hard things must I do to help for a lifetime?" And that, my dear friends, is what our trees want us to know. Thank you for the gift of your attention. I'm happy to answer questions later. And back to you, Gino. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karin. Really, really appreciate that. Yeah, and definitely start thinking about those questions, panelists, because we're going to go ahead and throw them at the end here for you. Really, really beautiful. And I definitely have a question for you later, so just a sec on that one. So with our next presenter, Luke, I'd like to introduce you. Luke Klipp currently serves as a Metro Board Deputy to the Long Beach Mayor, Robert Garcia, and is the Education Director for Abundant Housing LA. As the Education Director, he actually gives webinars and on the decades of the systemic racist housing policies and practices that have led to, among many other issues, decreased tree canopy and access to trees in neighborhoods of people of color. He also supports the City of Long Beach's Mobility Bureau in its effort to make Long Beach a safer, more walkable, and bikeable place. Off to you, Luke.
Thanks so much, Gino, and thank you, Karin. I feel like I just went on a journey with you, and as a fellow pluviophile, I cannot wait for the rains to actually return here sooner the better. For those participating today, my name is Luke. I'm wearing a red polo, and my hair is shockingly white. Unfortunately, that has happened way sooner than I might have cared for. So I'm going to go ahead and just dive in here in this PowerPoint that I've prepared for y'all. And I just want to note there's a lot here, and I recognize that we're going to move fairly quickly. And I also just want to acknowledge that what I'm going to share here is fairly LA focused, but it is not limited to Los Angeles. The story that I'm going to share with you today is actually quite universal for much of our land use policies around the country here. So I live in Los Feliz, and this is just a quick overhead shot of Los Feliz. You can see the Griffith Observatory, the Hollywood sign in the distance, and lots and lots and lots of trees. But this is not how it always used to be here in Los Angeles. And going back even just a little over a century, much of Los Angeles. Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. Can you speak up just a little bit? I think some people are having trouble hearing you.
Sure. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. Well, so much of Los Angeles a little over a century ago was like brush and shrubbery, and trees were really kind of limited to the few areas where there's year-round water access, which was actually where a lot of the native peoples who've lived here for tens of thousands of years really had their early settlements. Downtown Los Angeles being sort of one of the most significant ones, which is also why downtown is located there today. But trees are not something that were sort of ubiquitous across the LA region as much as they are in many communities today, which is to say that they really sort of came about in the urban canopy in LA along and concurrent with development in LA. So it's important for us to sort of see what changed, sort of what's been the last century of land use history that sort of got us to this point today. So the first thing I'm just going to be very clear about, our cities are segregated by design. It is not accidental. And one of the most critical tools in achieving that segregation has been single-family housing. The city of Los Angeles, of all of residentially zoned areas, 75% is zoned single-family. LA is one of the first adopters of single-family zoning in 1921. This zoning was created in a way to segregate communities. Homes were available, single-family homes were available for purchase only by white people and for resale to white people. And these were racial and deed covenants that the Supreme Court upheld in the mid-1920s across the country, which exists still today in many single-family homes. You could find deed covenants that actually still restrict resale of homes to white folks, although they're no longer legally enforceable. And I think many people would be shocked to know that they still exist. But that is sort of where single-family housing came about. That is our history of sort of what this was designed to do. And subsequent to that, we had the Great Depression in the late 1920s, early 1930s, where a number of folks were without homes. And one of the key tools as part of the New Deal was the creation of the Federal Housing Authority, or the FHA, in 1934. The Federal Housing Authority created the single largest infusion of federal resources into housing, with the feds backing 30-year mortgages for single-family homes for the very first time. If you wanted to buy a single-family home prior to this, the only way you could do that was through private banks with their sort of willingness to lend to you. The federal government stepped in and said, we'll create this long, extended 30-year time window so people can have an extended period of time to pay these things out and reduce their monthly costs. And this is quite possibly the largest affordable housing subsidy ever provided. It led to a period of substantial new single-family housing construction across the country. But as we'll see through one of the more notable tools, redlining, that federal support was limited to white home buyers. And in fact, even in addition to redlining and what I mentioned previously around deed covenants and race restrictions, only white veterans returning from World War II were able to receive federal veterans homebuyer lending support. And even the federally funded public housing that was created in order to provide housing for those who couldn't afford a 30-year mortgage was explicitly segregated on the basis of race. All of these segregations were perfectly legal from the start of the 20th century until 1968, with the passage of the Fair Housing Act, which only was passed by Congress and only overcame objections in Congress with the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. And a week later, the Fair Housing Act was finally passed in 1968. So we had decade upon decade of racially exclusionary and segregated housing policy, land use policies, which really directed how resources were allocated across our region. So what does that look like in a city like Los Angeles? This is the redlining map for central Los Angeles. This was used for 40 years to determine where someone could receive a federally backed 30-year mortgage. And you see 4 different colors on the map. There's green, there's blue, there's yellow, and there's red. The green colored areas were areas where you would have no trouble receiving a 30-year backed, federally subsidized backed mortgage. Blue areas, you might have some challenges, but for the most part, it was not too difficult in those areas. In the yellow areas, it was almost impossible to receive a federally backed 30-year mortgage. And in the red areas, it was impossible. You could not receive a federally backed mortgage if you were trying to purchase a home in one of these areas that was redlined, that was colored red on the redlining map. So how did they make these determinations of these different colors? And the intent here was to make sure that the federal government was limiting its risk when it was backing a 30-year mortgage. Well, let's look at 2 different communities that are circled on the map. One on the green in the center left side is Cheviot Hills, and then on the right in the red circle is East LA. These 2 communities are just 10 miles apart. So here's the description that was provided for Cheviot Hills, which is that it had business and professional men, motion picture people with incomes between $3,000 and $8,000 a year. They noted that there's 0% foreign families, no nationalities, 0% Negroes, and they described shifting or infiltration with slight infiltration of American Jewish families noted. And then further on down, the description of this area includes that the deed restrictions limit improvements to single-family dwellings. In other words, you could only build single-family homes in this community that had come at a minimum cost of $4,000, which is a significant amount of money when this map was created in the 1930s. And then they note that it protects in perpetuity against what they describe as subversive racial elements. This was the official document used to determine if you could receive a federally backed mortgage in this community for 40 years. Now, the description for East LA is a little different. It notes that there were Jewish professional and businessmen, Mexican laborers, Works Progress Administration workers with incomes of 7,000. Oh, sorry, I had to turn off the closed captioning. So I'm going to go back to my screen share here. Here we go. All right. And then they noted in their description of East LA that it had Russian, Polish, Armenian Jews, Slavs, Greeks, American Mexicans, Japanese, and Italians. And they described it as having subversive racial elements increasing. And further on down, described as literally honeycombed with diverse and subversive racial elements. It is seriously doubted whether there is a single block in the area which does not contain detrimental racial elements. And there are very few districts which are not hopelessly heterogeneous in type of improvement and quality of maintenance. This was the description that then meant that the federal government saw this as being too high of a risk to provide a federally backed mortgage for someone looking to live and purchase a home in East LA. So how do these things play out? Because this was 40 years of official policy up until the mid-1970s when this was finally outlawed. So let's look at the urban canopy in these communities today. This is on the left is Cheviot Hills, a residential street in Cheviot Hills, and then Motor Avenue, which is the main corridor going into Cheviot Hills. On the right, we have East LA. We have a residential street in the upper right-hand side, which shows no trees along the street. There's a couple of palm trees on someone's property. And then 4th Street on the lower right-hand side with a couple ficus trees, which are probably nearing the end. I don't know, but they're probably 70, 80 years old, depending on their size, and probably no doubt are tearing up the sidewalks as well. The one thing I would note about Motor Avenue and Cheviot Hills in the lower left-hand side and East 4th Street in the lower right-hand side, these 2 streets have about the same amount of traffic they accommodate every day. The width from curb to curb is the same. But in Cheviot Hills in the lower left, you have a bike lane, you have a planted median down the middle, and it's lined with trees. 4th Street on the lower right, you have 4 lanes for moving vehicles and parking lanes, no bike lanes, no planted median, and a couple of ficus trees. This is a satellite view looking at Cheviot Hills from above. You can see trees throughout. Looking at East LA, you can actually pick out 4th Street moving from left to right because it's the only place with any big trees in the community. The demographics in Cheviot Hills today in 2010 is over 90% non-Hispanic white, and on the right in East LA, over 95% Latino. So there's some other things that redlining has had lingering effects today. These are the incomes today for these two communities. With Cheviot Hills, average household income over $150,000 a year. East LA, just south of $40,000 a year average household income. And that translates into poverty levels, where Cheviot Hills, these are the quartiles. These are color-coded by quartiles throughout the state of California. Cheviot Hills is in the top 25% of incomes of any communities in the state of California, East LA in the bottom 25%. And I'm going to show you the next map, which shows the urban canopy, and you might see something interesting about this, which is that the urban canopy is almost a direct inverse of the poverty levels, where going back to the poverty levels, the areas with the highest poverty, now moving forward to the urban canopy, also have the most urban canopy. Cheviot Hills has 23 to 40% urban canopy cover. East LA has 0 to 11% urban canopy cover. The next slide depicts what that sort of looks like graphically, where you can see the areas that were sort of green lined to the north of Beverly Hills, West Hollywood, up in the hills. Those are all full of trees. Cheviot Hills is sort of the exception in the basin and sort of sticks out there. And most of the basin of the LA basin is 0 to 11% urban canopy cover. In terms of air quality, this is the California EnviroScreen 3.0, which looks at air quality across the entire state. Folks from the Bay Area know that Los Angeles is notorious for its poor air quality. The Cheviot Hills community actually is in the top 20% of best air quality in the state of California, versus East LA, which is in the bottom 10% of worst air quality in the state of California. Again, these communities are 10 miles apart. And that translates into rates of asthma, where we have Cheviot Hills with some of the lowest rates of asthma in the state, and East LA with some of the highest rates of asthma. You can see on this map, this also shows some of the freeways, or excuse me, it shows the freeway network in LA. And there is something else to note about that freeway network, which I want to call out. Freeways were built primarily in the 50s and 60s when there came about a large infusion of federal dollars, where the federal government backed local dollars 9 to 1. And local governments saw freeways for serving two purposes. One was to enhance mobility. The other was to remove blight. And freeways were built directly through and around existing communities throughout all of the country. And certainly here in Los Angeles, we're no exception. And these two pictures sort of help you see how the communities where they went through, there were homes that had to be removed. Tens of thousands of people were displaced to build our freeway networks. And if you look again at this redlining map, zoomed out a little bit here, with the two communities highlighted, Cheviot Hills on the left, East LA on the right, and we overlay the freeway network, which hadn't been built when the redlining map was created, but were built when redlining was perfectly legal. You'll see that in East LA, there are now 6 freeways that cut through and around East LA. And Cheviot Hills, the only freeway that comes near it, actually turns a little bit to the south, so it sort of goes around it. There was one other freeway that sort of notoriously was intended to be built and wasn't, which I've depicted here with a dashed line, an extension of the 2 freeway, which ended up getting killed in no small part because it was planned through a number of communities that had been green and blue lined in these redlining maps, who had more political agency and power and more wealth, and they fought it and defeated it. There are additional things, though, that connect to our redlining practices. For starters, redlining can be tied directly to the amount of heat communities experience. A study from a couple of years ago looked at over 100 urban areas across the country and found that formerly red-line neighborhoods in every city, nearly every city studied, were hotter than non-red-line neighborhoods. In Los Angeles, that difference is about 8 degrees Fahrenheit. So we're about to head into a nearly historic heat wave this week. This is going to be felt very much so in communities that are formerly red-line communities. This also translates into what I describe as traffic violence and street safety, where our formerly red-line communities are far less safe for people walking, biking, and taking transit, or rolling down the sidewalk, however they move and get through our community. Our formerly red-line communities are far less safe. And I would tie this directly to our urban canopies, because as we know, when you have more trees, communities that the areas around the trees get less hot in those hot summer days. They're also, when you have more trees on streets, people tend to drive more slowly and be more observant of their surroundings. So what's happening in LA's urban canopy today, though, is we are seeing our urban canopy decline, largely on account of the changing nature of our single family housing. Because we relied for so long on those communities that we green and blue lined to provide urban canopy in our region, we're now seeing, as our home prices escalate dramatically, there is a strong preference toward much larger homes, adding pools, adding other features, whatever the case may be. And all of these things are now the most significant driver on the reduction of our urban canopy in LA, is the escalating price of housing that's leading to our single family housing homes getting much bigger and the increased demand on sort of what they provide. So I just want to sort of offer a couple key takeaways. One is that the urban canopy coverage before the 20th century growth that we've seen in not just LA, but I've limited my presentation here to LA, was fairly sparse and limited primarily to those areas near year-round freshwater sources, which would then mean that our urban canopy that we have right now is largely tied to the development that's grounded in a half century of racist housing practices that, as I've shown through the various maps here, persists today in any number of ways, linking race and wealth with urban canopy coverage. And the result is disparities in things like our air quality, heat, public health, life expectancy, et cetera. I think it's important to also acknowledge in this, though, that we created this urban canopy and we can keep creating this urban canopy. It's the daily decisions that we make, the yearly decisions we make about our trees. What we have today is a reflection of decisions we made decades ago, and we can continue to make decisions that decades from now will provide more urban canopy. So what can you do? I think, frankly, the most key thing that I take away from this is the need to support efforts to plant trees in public rights of way in our historically redlined communities, because these are our communities that have continually sort of borne the brunt of the convenience of primarily white, wealthier, single-family households. They should be able to have cleaner air, cooler temperatures in the summer, and on down the line. So I offer also here promoting planting street trees as a way to reduce energy usage, reduce water runoff, and make our communities healthier. There are different organizations, municipal bodies, et cetera, that have vested interests in these things. I've identified them here in parentheticals: power companies, water companies, public health organizations, who don't necessarily see trees as their reason to do the work they do, but stand to benefit significantly by being a part of this. I've offered some resources here. Josh will go ahead and put those in the chat, and I'm happy to take questions after. Thank you.
Thank you so much for all that information, Luke. I mean, it's definitely eye-opening. I think especially when the quality work that I specifically work on, when we talk about redlining, and people sometimes deny that history, but to like see it with the comparisons that you provided is very, very insightful, because I don't think many people get to see that granular information of, that's how they disclose what you can go ahead and do in terms of obtaining that loan versus, the overlay of the maps between the canopy and the districting is really, really, really profound. So thank you so much for sharing all that. We got our final panelist, Robyn Purchia. Robyn is a mother of 2 young children and dedicated to environmental advocacy. After years practicing environmental law, Robyn decided to pursue her career in journalism, and she contributed to the Huffington Post, Sojourners, Clean Technica, and Think Progress. In 2015, she began writing for the San Francisco Examiner as a columnist, and Robyn volunteers for Mothers Out Front, a nonprofit mobilizing mothers, grandmothers, and others to protect a livable climate for all children. She's currently an attorney with the California Public Utilities Commission and working on the advocacy side to protect ratepayers and safety advocates. Robyn, take us away.
Thank you, Gino. And you all might hear my kids in the background during my presentation. First, my pronouns are she and her. I'm a white woman talking to you on occupied Ohlone land in what is now known as San Francisco. And as Gino mentioned, I have a column about the environment in the San Francisco that I've had for exactly 5 years now. And I've covered our urban canopy here from various angles, thanks in no small part to Josh, who put this webinar together, and an amazing set of tree advocates that we have here in the city. So what I'd like to do in my brief presentation is set a foundation for how San Francisco manages its urban canopy, and then build on that to describe some of the equity issues that I've seen reporting on this. And I'd like to invite Josh or any other advocates on this call to please correct anything that I say or build on it, because I really, my knowledge really just is from their expertise. So anything that they want to say to correct what I'm saying is more than welcome. So one of my favorite things about covering the environment in San Francisco is there's no shortage of news here. Our policymakers really, really like environmental headlines. And 2016 was a big year for that when it came to our urban canopy. Under our former mayor, Ed Lee, the city set a goal to plant 50,000 trees by 2034. And that same year, San Francisco voters overwhelmingly passed Proposition E to implement a new street trees program. And that program is really important because it transferred power to manage our street trees from property owners to the city. So now the Department of Public Works here has authority and funding to assess the condition of San Francisco's urban canopy and remove those street trees that it deems as hazardous. The program does not include any funding for planting. Those resources come from sales tax money, developer fees, grants, the general fund, and other programs. So it's not as consistent as Prop E funding. It's also important to note that the Department of Public Works is not the only city agency here with authority over our urban canopy. Our Recreation and Parks Department has authority to remove trees through its I think it's called Natural Resources Program. It's their Habitat Resources Program. And the Public Utilities Commission, the City Public Utilities Commission also can permit tree removal, as well as other agencies such as the Presidio Trust. So I hope what I'm doing is I'm presenting a picture here of a very complicated jurisdictional landscape with a lot of agencies in control and really no coordinated strategy for how we would plant 50,000 trees by 2034. And this is even worse because funding and incentives are directed to removing trees, not planting them. So this has unsurprisingly led to a shrinkage of our urban canopy. Last year, I reported that between 2017 and 2018, the number of trees planted exceeded the number of trees removed by only one. So those numbers, there may be more current numbers on that, but obviously San Francisco is not on track to meet its goal of 50,000 trees by 2034. And this is a big problem for social justice and equity. As Luke just mentioned, trees provide a lot of benefits. They shade hot sidewalks and streets, they filter air pollution, they suck up rainwater to reduce sewer flooding, they can pull carbon out of the atmosphere and alleviate climate change. Studies have shown that trees can reduce stress levels and blood pressure and increase mental engagement, attentiveness, and happiness. Other research has found that communities with large street trees have lower crime and slower traffic. So when these benefits are not equally distributed in San Francisco or in any city, it's a problem for social justice. And to be clear, the neighborhoods with the fewest street trees tend to be lower income. I think it was last year, I reported on the city's very controversial proposal to remove 48 ficus trees in our Mission District. That is a historically, I guess it would be historically low income and Mexican neighborhood here in San Francisco, or of Latin heritage, I should say. Many of those ficus trees that they proposed to remove were indeed hazardous. Luke touched on this too, that ficus trees tend to tear up sidewalks and they can grow more hazardous the older that they get, especially if they're not regularly maintained. But the health and safety of some of the trees was questionable, and neighborhood groups didn't want them all removed because they were a part of their community. So in their appeals, in these neighborhood groups' appeals for these tree removal permits, they linked the loss of their ficus trees to unprecedented gentrification and displacement. Appealing these tree removal permits, just the process of how you would appeal them, raises equity issues in itself. There's a very active group called the San Francisco Forest Alliance here in San Francisco that I think has done a great job for all San Franciscans holding recreation and park accountable for its eucalyptus tree removals through its habitat restoration efforts. The group is organized, they attend agency meetings and hearings, and the members who I have met have professional backgrounds and speak English as a first language. In contrast, there are many individual San Franciscans who care about trees but don't have the same resources, and they don't know what they're supposed to do. I get a lot of emails from individuals around the city who are looking for some press attention because they want to keep the trees in front of their house. They love these trees, and they don't know how to keep them. One of the most egregious examples of tree removal I heard came from a family in the Bayview, which Gino mentioned this in his presentation, is a neighborhood that is historically low income, is primarily a community of color, and continues to have a smaller amount of street trees than other neighborhoods. The neighborhood is also dealing with toxic radioactive waste from a Navy shipyard, higher levels of air pollution from traffic and industrial uses, and the people there have higher levels of chronic diseases, including asthma. So in this neighborhood, the Public Works Department proposed to remove 5 trees on a family's private property to widen a sidewalk. The family who planted these trees planted them over 20 years ago. They are immigrants, and they relied on them both for food and for medicinal purposes. Through their high school daughter, the family filed a protest, which I think is important to highlight just in itself, because we're in a landscape today where immigrants fear coming forward a lot of the time. But they came forward, and before their appeal could be heard, the Public Works Department removed the trees. So recovery was moot at this point. So just to wrap things up on that high note, San Francisco is doing a great job when it comes to making headlines, but when it comes to incorporating equity into where it decides to plant trees, how it's growing its canopy, and the ability for individual San Franciscans to protect the trees that they love, the city can do a lot more to incorporate equity into those. And so I'm very excited to hear all the questions that people have. I'm happy we have some time for that.
Thanks so much, Robyn.